Mr. Brendan Graham Dempsey, thank you very much for joining me again. It's been a while since our last chat. We're discussing metamodernism, some very interesting topics. But today we're going to discuss your new book. It's part 2 of the Evolution of Meaning series. It's the second one.
Yes, correct. Volume 2. Yeah. And thanks, by
Volume
the way, for
2.
having me back on your fantastic podcast. I'm very happy to and looking forward to getting into some great conversation.
Totally, man. Yeah. No, and I love your work. I always keep up with your conversations and what you got going on, man. You're really like an institution in this little corner of the internet. So, yeah,
Oh, hi.
it's great to have you on. And to read the book as well, because I hadn't read the first one. And I kind of found myself wondering, like, evolution of meaning, why that topic in particular. Is it connected to the meaning crisis? Is it, what was the motivation for focusing on meaning?
So I think it definitely is kind of very much directed to the question of the meaning crisis, I think in large part because what do we mean by meaning? When people talk about a meaning crisis, when they talk about individuals feeling a lack of meaning, or collectively, sociologically, in terms of the confusion of our sort of shared meaning, what do we mean by meaning is sort of like the big question. And I think a lot of people obviously have a very intuitive sense of that, but I wanted to kind of go down to first principles and follow that through. And I was reading a lot of work that was starting to clarify a picture for me in a particular way. And once you got that picture, once you had some clarity around what we meant by meaning, a lot of things started falling into place in terms of being able to sync up what this all is getting at into the various aspects of our kind of collective problem and what people experience in terms of existential and faith crises and things like that. And it really seemed to just offer this really powerful, elegant way to understand a lot of that stuff through like a really fundamental philosophical vector. So not only was I interested in that, but I was also interested in the bigger question around meaning and how it changes and grows and develops and complexifies. And so that's kind of what the evolution of meaning part is sort of getting at, is that there's not just sort of meaning and humans have a particular kind of meaning or set of meanings that we hold to or should hold to or anything like that. It's sort of what is meaning, how does it operate, and then what does that then look like, those principles, when you see them kind of operating in different contexts across human cultural evolution. So yeah, I felt like it gets at clarifying some of the core concepts there, but also then points the way to where we're going, where we've been, and kind of why the things feel the way that they do at the moment.
Yeah, and it's desperately needed as well. I think there was a lot of kind of bad press around meaning, really, particularly in like 20th century philosophy. A lot of the time it was like such a strange, like, unless there was like an ultimate teleology to everything, it's like everything was meaningless and pointless. And it just became this weird, like, Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill kind of thing. It was like meaning. I loved how you defined it at the start of the book, really, as like semantic, like information that's meaningful to your goals, essentially. Like that's meaningful for the survival of the organism. Like it's so fundamental to being a human being to experience meaning. Like it's not this weird kind of other thing.
Totally.
It's foundational in a way.
Well, and I think you're exactly right. I mean, a lot of the existentialists and folks in the 20th century, the absurdists and people kind of grappling with the sense of, oh no, life is meaningless. Actually, I was just watching the beginning of Annie Hall last night with Woody Allen, and same kind of thing. That's just sort of like obsessive, neurotic, like, but everything's meaningless and life is suffering and all this stuff. And it's sort of like, and what's interesting about that though is that I think you can understand what's going on there better if you appreciate that that is a sort of negation or antithesis of a particular kind of meaning, or understanding rather of what meaning is, that people were experiencing. They're sort of like, oh, and then you have to relate it to what that was responding to, which was the kind of large scale falling apart, crumbling of sort of older, more traditional belief structures in the 20th century. And so if it's not sort of classic traditional metaphysics and ontology and that meta narrative, then you view everything in terms of that, but you just view it as absent that, negating that, and then you feel a sense of loss because you're sort of relating it to something that isn't the case. And so a lot of 20th century philosophy and the existentialist kind of moves in that direction, and sort of grappling with what does it mean to not have meaning in the way that we used to believe in this. But there's an important move that when you rethink of what meaning is and you think about it on its own terms and not in relationship to something that, you know, is this old way of thinking about meaning that doesn't exist anymore, then you can actually see how potent and pregnant every moment is with a kind of meaning, and it kind of flips the entire script. So yeah, I think that that's another
There's
really
something
important
really
part of this.
fundamental there as well, though, because it seems like that kind of nihilism that comes in the 20th century, and even with like Nietzsche and these early kind of guys, it was really like the mechanical universe. I like go back to Copernicus and Galileo and this kind of scientific revolution that like undermines, you know, the Aristotelian picture of reality, and then that worldview kind of just undercuts that whole, you know, whatever the discarded image or the kind of grand medieval synthesis, and so you end up with this almost like flat ontology, like very materialist. There's no transcendence. There is no point in that sense, and you end up, as you pointed out, like this kind of free falling, almost like a building demolition or something, where you lose access to these higher levels, and so people are then struggling to just like how do I orient myself in the world at all in any sense. But then when you go what you're saying, which is like go back almost to the level of attention, I think about it a lot of the time, like John Vervaeke's relevance realization, that it's like your attention is caught by what is meaningful. Like it is, you know, a fact in a sense. It orients, your attention is controlled by value, or should be controlled by value. Sometimes it's controlled by valueless things, unfortunately, but it is like, it's part of how we navigate the complex environment. In some sense, that brings it back down to earth, if that makes sense, in a way that, I don't know, it
Yeah, I
feels
mean,
like the future.
last time we talked, yeah, about metamodernism, a lot of my initial attraction to metamodernism and how I was thinking about it was framed actually in these terms, which this work has continued to help clarify. Which I was getting at how if you want to think about kind of that move from kind of the traditional pre-modern worldview into modernity, there's this kind of move away from this sort of transcendent frame as being the kind of orientation for all meaning and value, into this modernist frame that then starts to see these things sort of, you know, looking for the transcendent in the kind of mundane, you know, aspects of reality. But it was still there was an immanentizing of this, but it was still there. It was still, there were aspects that like the modernists were still aspiring to in terms of, you know, a kind of grandeur and even sublimity.
Yeah, like James Joyce and Ernest Hemingway,
Totally.
and like,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
the normal life, like the meaning of the extraordinary in the mundane or something.
Exactly. And that was very much kind of what those modernists were getting at. And then when you get into postmodernism, even that is sort of stripped away. And it's just this radical emphasis of immanence and the mundaneness of everything. And so, yeah, thinking about what's happening now in sort of a meta modern move after that is something that I see as a return of transcendence. Right. That was actually the name of my first book on this. It was called Metamodernism and the Return of Transcendence. But it's a different kind of transcendence. It's actually a transcendence that you find in the world itself. So it's not a two worlds mythology where you're like transcending to some other place. It's a deepening. It's a expansiveness. It's these different kind of metaphors that we begin to use to think about the transcendent and the meaningful in a way that isn't that's more metaphysically sound relative to the insights of modernity.
Yeah. Oh man, I don't want to go off on an absolute tangent. I'm gonna say I wanted to send you a paper by Eric Pearl. I don't know if you've ever read it before on that, because you'd mentioned Plato at the start, and I think a lot of that interpretation as well of Plato as having like a two worlds mythology, that he's this like ontological dualist, is like a complete misreading, basically, that's been corrected by guys like Pearl or DC Schindler, where it was like he was actually talking about one reality in some sense. It's just like our perception versus reality, and then the transcendence is like getting a more refined picture of what's actually going on. It's not like two separate realms or something like that. But I think this question of transcendence is like, that's what's missing from the flat kind of ontology. I wonder, do you look at the meaning in life literature at all, the psychology of meaning in life?
A bit.
The
I mean,
three-factor model?
Well, no, I mean, not necessarily. I'd love to hear what if you've got things to throw in the pot. I've looked at some various meta analyses of like meaning in life literature in terms of the, you know, what kinds of general results do these things point to. And I think one of the challenges, though, that I've encountered with some of that literature is that they're often using different scales, the instruments, the different constructs are rather different. What do they mean by meaning, all these sorts of things. So it's a little bit messy out there. But and then the other thing that's interesting about that is that it's kind of the distinction sometimes I think that John Vervaeke does make in terms of the meaning in life versus meaning of life. And so those are also kind of somewhat different things. I have kind of my own take on that. And I think that they're not as distinct maybe as some people view them, but the meaning in life literature tends to be a lot more in terms of like, friends and happiness and fulfillment and these kinds of things. And those are all really important aspects of the thing that I'm interested in. But I'm also one, interested more philosophically of what we mean by this whole concept. And then two, using that to extend that into other ways of thinking about things, including the meaning of life, or is there a purpose to why we're here and these kinds of things. I think those are also really important ideas at the kind of worldview level that really have a big impact on the experiences of meaning that people have and their general well-being as well. So anyway, but yeah, so some degree, but yeah.
Yeah, and trying to piece together that worldview in some sense, like I totally agree with the kind of subjective, oftentimes like just subjective questionnaire kind of element of the meaning in life literature can be a bit dodgy. The one I'm referring to is the 3-factor coherence, purpose, significance as the like 3 dimensions of meaning in life. They're the kind of typical ones. I think it's like George and Park 2016 and Steiger would be the main use of that one. But they're interesting because I think when you put those together, really, it's like a functioning worldview. Vervaeke in Meaning Crisis talks about them as like the nomological, normative, narrative dimensions and how they all fit together into this kind of functioning worldview. But I see that as like, that's an evolution almost of that, the ground floor of meaning you've talked about. Yeah, I actually just taught a course on the Meaning Crisis with like
cool.
25
That's
people
great.
in Dublin or whatever. So I was talking about trying to think about this, exactly what you're doing, man, of like trying to discover that modern path to transcendence, like either dusting it off or like figuring out like, how do we get people participating in that in a way and getting that meaning, but without, just ignoring everything that's happened.
Totally. Well, first of all, I'll
Since.
say I'd love to like check out the syllabus that you used, and by all means, send me any of the
I'll send it
literature that
on.
you'd recommend for exploring this topic. I think this is such it's the most meaningful topic, right? It's meaning itself.
For sure.
So yeah, I'd love to hear all about the stuff that you're directly engaging with there. But yeah, I think this. I mean, just I can speak to my own experience of that, which is that moving through these distinct orientations to meaning in my own kind of life journey, I phenomenologically know what it's like to have these different orientations and what they feel like, right? In terms of just kind of basking in a kind of unquestioned, more naive understanding that my life is meaningful because it has relationship to some transcendent supernatural realm. That was a way in which my life was meaningful for a long time. When that metaphysical framing of meaning fell apart for me, then grappling with meaning in the way kind of what we were talking about with those existentialists is sort of like, I've lost this thing and now, there's no way to get it back. It was all a dream and an illusion and all this kind of thing. But I guess I need to just make the best of it here or whatever, and all these sorts of things. But then ironically, in my own experience, like I found that that just to live well and function well, there needed to be some kind of meaningful frame to my existence. And so that was an interesting thing to square with, like, well, why that, right? If this is kind of nonsense or it's all kind of an illusion, what's going on with this orientation that we have towards some sense of like our purpose or our meaning? And working with a kind of, I don't know, almost very kind of radically postmodern, post-truth kind of orientation, I thought, well, I'll just go in the meaning direction because it doesn't matter, right? Because it's all made up. But I found that the more I moved in the meaning direction, the more that I actually did feel better, that life was more rich and meaningful. And I actually wound up sort of clawing my way out of a kind of postmodern nihilism through postmodern nihilism. And on the other side of that, there was like, this new way then of beginning to think about meaning and the way that meaning frames our reality, until eventually finding these different models of how people are talking about meaning, going down into kind of deep structural elements of things in the world, to see that like there's a deep reality to this that then kind of, I think sort of anoints or christens this kind of new orientation of like, oh yeah, of course, this makes sense, because actually for us to function as viable, beings in the world, having some sense of orientation and values and all these kinds of things are actually like necessary prerequisites that just come with us being alive, right? Like to be alive as an organism, to have goals, to have normative states and states that I'm trying to achieve just like homeostatically, but also, sort of temporally. This is the basis of it all. And so you can't really escape it. And so all of a sudden meaning goes from this thing that is radically denuded from the world to like it's everywhere. And that is a big meaning shift, and changes your whole then relationship to all these things and makes you feel phenomenologically refreshed and refilled and refulfilled in a profound way. So I think there's something, a move like that is something that I think people are looking for out there right now. And
Totally.
they're looking in various places. I don't think a lot of the places a lot of people are looking is necessarily where they're going to successfully find some of that. And so some of my work is trying to just bring that to the fore and show people that this is a viable trajectory, and maybe one of the most important that people can explore right now these days.
Totally, man. It's the question. I think people are looking for meaning sometimes in the wrong places as well. That it's not we can't survive without it, but we can certainly get it in bad places as well from all sorts of problematic things, addictions and political extremism of whatever stripe. But so which framework? Because you bring up you talk in the first book. You discuss you talk a lot. Was that kind of important in terms of this evolution of meaning, of like seeing how meaning's like built into the structure of reality in some sense? Or
It definitely
at
played
least in our relationship with reality, sorry, transjectively.
Yeah. It played a big role, but it was more of a consolidating role. I'm trying to think if I were to trace it back, where it really came together for me. I think generally it followed something of this trajectory that moving from postmodernism into a metamodern sensibility had me exploring a lot of that material. And there's a certain kind of move that you see already in kind of this cultural metamodern sensibility shift that is something like what you find in Everything Everywhere All at Once or Rick and Morty. There's like an awareness that, yes, we've experienced nihilism, but we can't live there and we should get beyond that. And how do we do that? And then a lot of that kind of conclusion is, well, focus on your loved ones and your friendships and your family and like that kind of stuff, because that is felt as meaningful, and like you're foolish if you don't see that. And it's a very kind of pragmatic sort of approach to it, but it still leaves out this notion that like there's anything more to meaning than just sort of choosing to kind of willfully adopt a particular framework as really, really meaningful for you, and then just sort of like ignoring everything else. But still, I was sort of, that was the first step. And then as I was getting more into metamodern material, I found the work of Hansi Freinacht, who in his works is drawing a lot on other meta-theoreticians, people like Ken Wilber, and some developmental models. That turned me on to the whole developmental approach and to integral theory. And then reading Ken Wilber's works, I think it was Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, and seeing that was my kind of beginning of an introduction into complexity science and some of that. So then I went to all the sources that he was drawing on in that, and read Eric Chason and his Cosmic Evolution story, which looks at the energy information density increase over cosmic evolution. And as disparate and unconnected as that may sound, it actually was like this huge eye-opening experience, because it got me thinking about the way that there are these deep principles at work in terms of energy and information, and how we can look at complexity in the world, and how this leads to development over individual and collective spans. And then I had a kind of model. I had a sense of, oh, okay. And then I read Schrodinger's What is Life? And it's like, oh, life is a version of this as well. And you get into Ilya Prigogine, and it's like, yeah, complexity and the things that eventually lead to, complex entities like human beings are following a deep path through information and energy dynamic navigations that are the basis in some really significant way of valuations for entities and contexts. So I started planning this book because this vision was starting to come together of like, oh, I'm seeing something here. I'm going to tie all these pieces together. And then Bobby Azarian's book comes out, The Romance of Reality. And I read that and I'm like, oh, well, I don't have to write that book because Bobby already wrote it. And so that was both a relief, but also a delight, because I think he lays it out so well there. And then that kind of, again, to sort of both turned me on to a particular set of ideas, but also kind of reaffirmed that this was like there's really a big picture, here about reality. Specifically, though, one of the things that that book did turn me on to was the work of Artemie Kolchinsky and David Wolpert, who are these two complexity theorists at Santa Fe Institute. And they were kind of using information theory and sort of thermodynamics to talk about meaning. And they have a paper on that I thought, this now really begins to ground out this sense of meaning and what that looks like. And when you put all these pieces together and you add in a million other more that I've been reading across the last 4 or so years, you just get a beautiful picture that's really coherent and elegant and sublime of this, beginning from the basic first principles. Complexification and emergence lead to these new regimes of complexity in which new kinds of valuation and care and meaning show up. And so the UTOC model fits into that. When I got that model, it was sort of like, here's the big map of how this is all unfolding, and so you take the ideas from all these different thinkers and you just lay them down on the UTOC tree of knowledge map, and you're like, oh yeah, there it all is, from energy and information to matter to life to mind to culture and beyond. Symbolic, or let's say information processing, is leading to new kinds of ways of interpreting meaning at all these different scales, until eventually you get to symbolic information processing and what human beings do. And that's the basis of the human experience of meaning. And everything just clicked. So anyway, I could go on and on, but yeah, that was a big piece of the puzzle, getting that one in there.
Yes. And so in the complexity theory version of meaning, is that kind of rooted in similarly like active inference, like reducing uncertainty, like surprise, entropy, like that there's a valuation process in terms of how you configure yourself, I suppose, configure the dynamical system in order to deal with that kind of uncertainty?
Exactly.
That was part of it?
Yeah, I mean, active inference fits right in there. And so what I tried to do in my first book, the first volume, A Universal Learning Process, is try to bring a bunch of these theories together and give sort of the bigger meta-theoretical map of like, and John Vervaeke's work is in there, and relevance realization. But because they're all kind of telling the same sort of story, right? And it's so something, right? It's like there's, an entity that's in a context. Once you get anything like that, you're going to have a need for this thing to maintain itself as a distinct entity relative to its background context. And so basically, if it's a thing, it's not nothing. And nothing is sort of lacks structure, lacks informational integrity, and there's no energy required to create nothing, right? So if you think about equilibrium, it's just, it's no thing. Alicia Hararo makes that point in her book, Context Changes Everything. So if you think about equilibrium, thermodynamic equilibrium is just sort of like energy soup. There is no thing there. But once you have a thing, then you actually have an energy. You need energy to maintain that. Otherwise, it's just going to fall back into equilibrium and be the soup again. So what is maintaining this particular structure relative to non-structure? Well, you need energy coming in to do that, to fight back against entropy and to maintain this neg entropy, or this structure, this order. And so once you get that basic set of dynamics, then you appreciate that in the work that, for example, is able to link thermodynamics and information theory, that there is an informational connection between like an entity and its background context. And this is most clear, like, when you get to more complex entities, like if you think of a squirrel, there's going to be, a squirrel entity that is structurally defined and has informational integrity relative to nothing equilibrium. And it's going to need energy to maintain that structure. So it's going to go around, it's going to look for acorns and other food and this kind of thing to maintain its structure. If it doesn't do that, if it doesn't get the energy coming into its system, it's going to fall apart, just like we all do if we don't, get that influx of energy through food and nutrients. So that's the basic dynamic of it. And then that means that in the quest to relate optimally to the energy dynamics of that environment, there's information that's beneficial to that end or not. Right. And the information that is beneficial to that end has intrinsic quality to the squirrel in this case, because like if they don't get the acorns, they are no longer around. So the value is obvious there. Right. And then you just tie this all the way back into your own experience of value. It's like, oh, I'm hungry. Oh, I eat. Oh, this feels good. It's like, well, of course it does, because your valuation of the food is good for you as an entity. And so you start to see where values come from in the kind of cosmic evolutionary story. But then you can take those basic principles that are pretty complex at the level of like a squirrel, and you can follow them back through, lower and lower grades of complexity to the point where you could get to a cell. And a cell is doing a version of the same thing, but in a lot more simple kind of way, right? So it'll do chemotaxis. It'll navigate its sort of environs, and it will move towards nutrients through just sort of a natural chemical process, and it will move away from toxins. And it's an unconscious process, we probably. In the sense
I was
that
thinking I had Michael Levin in my head there. I
yeah,
was
right.
like, do we know?
Say, I'll put it this way: it lacks a central nervous system, so its form of consciousness is going to be, if there is one there, it's going to be radically different from like what my experience or our experience of consciousness is, because we have these complex bodies. But like, there's something going on there that it's doing a version of the same thing, and it's navigating to what is beneficial to it and away from what harms it. And then if you can trace this down even further, actually, you're looking at things like tornadoes and whirlpools and other kinds of what are called dissipative structures or dissipative systems that are basically working to maintain a kind of structure or ordered state by means of an energy exchange with their environment. And so there are non-biotic versions of this into biotic versions of this. And this was sort of Schrodinger's kind of insight about like what life is. And then you follow that all the way up the complexity stack. You add on a really complex nervous system, you add on symbolic information processing and linguistic mediation, and then you get beings like us who are able to have these kinds of experiences and experience these as meaningful. And so there's just a deep continuity that goes down and up this whole complexity stack. I don't know if that answered your question, but that was what I wanted to say.
It certainly did. And raised a few more, like the
I remembered you brought up active inference. That's what set me off there. So the whole point is, in like an active inference model, you've got this sense of having, you could say, a world model that you're updating in terms of how well it's able to predict, into the future, essentially your well-being, right? So when you experience a disturbance, I'll use this example, right? So, I get up every morning groggy, I go downstairs, let's say I make the coffee or whatever. And let's say I do this a million times. So I don't know if you ever have had this experience. Sometimes I'll get out of the shower and then I'll be like sitting in my chair and I'm like, wait, did I brush my teeth? Did I put on deodorant? Because like, it's so habitual, right? You're in autopilot mode because you're able to just check out and just do something else because it's so predictable that you can just move right along. Now, the thing is, if I'm get up and I walk down the stairs and the last stair isn't there, and I didn't know that. Or I'm going to go brush my teeth absentmindedly, but I'm all of a sudden out of toothpaste, right? Then things are brought to my attention, and I'm like, oh, wait a second, I can't just sort of move through this. And so this is surprise. So the thing that would be good for me, I need to attend to. And so we build up these world models based on what we can kind of confidently predict. And the things that surprise or upset those models then kind of throw us out of equilibrium, as it were, and they introduce this kind of entropy. So generally speaking, we're aiming to minimize that because we want to have we want to have a successful model of the world that's sort of mapping things really well. And that's kind of the same basic idea here. So this occurs at differing levels of complexity across the stack, but it plugs right into the same idea, because entities ultimately are thermodynamic things in the universe that need to continue by means of energy and information exchange. And so when you get the complex nervous system and a brain that's able to model reality, that's just a really, really complex version of that deep process at play. And so the valuations that we have in terms of surprise or delight or awe or terror relate to how well our kind of predictions are mapping things. And the last thing I'll say about this, I mean, there's a lot more to say about it, is that it's actually really interesting because what we talk about is the sacred, I make an argument for in my book, is actually directly tied to this dynamic in a specific way that I find really valuable. And if we had a sense for how that played in, we could actually also, in the same way that we've kind of re-engaged notions of meaning from a different vantage, we can understand what the sacred is about from using the same kind of conceptual toolkit. But I'm rambling frenetically, so I'll pause.
No, you've covered quite a bit of ground there. It's very admirable. From all the way from the start of the universe to us having this conversation, like that's it's no mean feat. So but I always thought about that. Yeah, the second law of thermodynamics. That everything is tending towards disorder, but then life kind of goes the opposite direction, and that's the basis of us. That we have this kind of challenge of maintaining our self-organization, I suppose, unlike the tornado, which just when the conditions change, it dissipates. We're actually capable of changing our environment, updating our models in order to keep that process going. And then I suppose you kind of get to the level of culture as well. I mean, the model thing for me is just so interesting. Like once you bring that in, it really opens the door, I think, to a lot of interesting ways of thinking. I don't know if you've read any of is it Buzine? He brings in narrative and mythology as generative models, essentially. That they're generative models oriented towards the future. Essentially like low-res models that are for how we behave in novel circumstances that we're not going to encounter, that like bootstraps us like intergenerationally. And like it's a really interesting I suppose way of bringing in some of that stuff that we lost from the kind of like hardcore materialism in the 20th century.
In his best work, I think, like in Maps of Meaning, I think Jordan Peterson is actually making the same kind of point in terms of
very similar. I thought he was in Maps of Meaning, like he had some conversations with Carl Friston that were very on that topic as well, of how very interesting, like how similar they were in. Like Peterson was ahead of the curve, really, I think, in Maps of Meaning of recognizing a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, and that's something I'm really interested in to try to bring in. I mean, he's obviously not the only one making these kinds of points. He's drawing, of course, a lot on Jung and others, kind of the Jungian tradition and others. But like the idea of chaos and order and how we navigate these using story and these kinds of things, and what is the optimal relationship between them as well is also really important. This is dialectic that each pole has its own problems, but the sweet spot in between is complexity. And so
that's where meaning comes from, was his argument.
Totally. So anyway, I mean, I once you see this picture, you actually start seeing it everywhere, and hopefully not in just a radically conspiratorial way, but like a way that you're like, this is the way all this is working, of course.
This is
and that's what was really meaningful and significant to me when I found a lot of this stuff, because up until that point, it had been 30 or so years of like reading a lot, but in a lot of different areas, reading a lot of literature, philosophy, but, also, I don't know, like across the humanities generally, and starting to get into some of the science and always being interested in, things like cosmology and, sort of big history to some degree. But then when you have this kind of framework, it's like, I can situate all of that as part of as something here, and you can see the whole way. And a lot of this is a lot of what my book is going to be aiming towards is looking at human history and seeing the meaning systems that we've developed across cultural evolution as manifestations of this in particular. So that's where the Evolution of Meaning series is going. And that's why I take the time to kind of go into all this. It's fascinating in its own right, but I mean, that could be its own series. But I'm really just setting this up as like, okay, once we understand the deep structures here, now we can turn our attention to human culture and human cultural history and see how there's been a complexification of meaning systems that's been following a similar kind of trajectory. And then you can kind of zoom in on each one of those meaning systems and how it works and why and that sort of thing. And that's kind of it's
nearly a way to like reconstruct the humanities in a way that we're so like heavily deconstructed in postmodernism in a way. A lot of what I'm hearing you saying and what I'm seeing myself, I suppose, is that there's a synthesis going on, like a grand synthesis of trying to bring all these things together in a way that can kind of undo the fragmentation that's occurred because of the post, which I think was necessary, to be honest. People rag on it a lot, but it was you can't get to C without going through B kind of thing.
Yeah, totally.
And so in your second book then you focus a lot on moral development and on the kind of stages of development. I mean, why do you take that step next in this process? Like, how does that connect?
Well, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked it, and I hope more people ask it if it's not clear, because I could see it being kind of a leap. But the point is basically this, that this is all a complexification process, right? So if you look at how these things unfold and what the dynamics are, they're a ratcheting effect of complexity, and they lead to more and more things coming together, integrating, and you get these sort of you get this this uptake of complexity, and we see this in the cosmic scale across cosmic evolution. And again, like that's where Chason's work is great, and we see that in the UTOC model and everything. But so if we appreciate that this whole big thing is complexifying by means of entities emerging and then having meanings of various kinds that they are trying to work towards and have increasingly complex forms of valuation, basically. Well, when you finally get to human culture and you see that we're a version of that, then the question is, well, how does this play out specifically at that plane of complexity, at the human cultural plane of complexity? Now, in the UTOC model, which is, again, this map of the complexity planes, each one is defined by a distinct kind of information processing. And so, life emerges through genetic information processing. And then, out of life, you get mind, and that emerges when you get neuronal information processing built off of genetic information processing. And then with humans, you get symbolic information processing, which is built off neuronal, which is built off genetic information processing. And so it's at the symbolic level of language that what we're doing as humans and at the cultural level is really going on. And so to zoom into human meaning is to essentially zoom into the way that we use symbolic language to conceptualize, represent the world, and then give expression to our intentions, our goal states. And then there's something really interesting that happens with the emergence of language, which is that we're able to work together. I can bring you into my mind by means of the informational exchange that we're doing right now in a way that animals can't. So it's a very distinct, unique thing that gets opened up by means of propositional language. And by the way, to be clear, it's not to say that other animals don't have communication. There are various kinds of communication and very rich kinds in the animal kingdom, but there's a specific kind that emerges with Homo sapiens, which is the symbolic propositional information that we're doing. And what that allows specifically is for like me to take ideas from my head and put them into your head by means of the language. So we can actually do a number of things, which is you can start to get into my interiority and I can get into your interiority, and my goal states can become your goal states. We can communicate with language, and we can actually have increasingly complex networking of individual humans in collective groups that have shared values and goals and norms. So now you're into the realm of like anthropology and sociology and all of that. But there's an interesting feedback loop, because as you enter into human society, you are being enculturated. And famously, the sociologists appreciate this, like Peter Berger and Luckman and all this stuff, right? To be a human is to be a socialized person. Like there aren't human persons absent human society. And the insight from that then is that my entire sense of myself as an individual comes through my enculturation into a group. That group and its goals are the product of a bunch of individuals coming together and having shared goals and group norms and these kinds of things. So there's a dialectic in play of the individual and the collective feeding back into each other. And so what I'm interested in is, okay, that's a novel thing that's happening at the human level, but we can't understand human meaning and human meaning making without understanding that process. And so if we zoom in on what's going on there, we zoom in on the kind of the mechanics of it, so to speak, and how it's unfolding through language, then we get to an understanding that the entire way that human beings come into culture and develop and get socialized and enculturated and learn is a unique version of this broader kind of learning process that we see happening in other places. So, the first volume is called a universal learning process. It's the basic dynamics and mechanics that we see at all these scales. But if you zoom in and see how does this play out at the human level, then you're really looking at how do humans learn? And that gets you into human developmental psychology. And so now you're already on the track of Piaget and Baldwin and the neo-Piagetians and all of that. And the key about that, I'll say briefly, is that also brings you then to complexity, not surprisingly, because the developmental psychologists in the Piagetian tradition were identifying that learning is an evolutionary process. It uses the same variation and selective retention kind of mechanics of evolution. And as the neo-Piagetians realized, this is a complexification process. And so you get the construct of hierarchical complexity when you actually study how humans learn. So the big takeaway from all that is that human learning is a complexification process. And what I'm claiming is that human learning complexification process is a version of a broader process underway in the universe that's a universal learning process. But to understand it at the human level, you have to go deep into the developmental model. So that's why I'm focusing on that in this next volume.
So
volume 2.
it's kind of a preamble to reconnecting it more to the universal model, or to the universal learning process within the individual. So let's go to the kind of start of that process, I think. And would you be fair to say we kind of start off as egocentric in a way, like locked into our attentional umwelt, and we're kind of like pleasure, pain, immediate desires, short-term salience kind of thing. Like
Yeah,
that's like
basically.
ground zero.
Well, I would go a step further even before that, and I think even before there's any of that, there's just sort of a radical lack of differentiation, and so it's hard to have any memories of this because we're so young. But in terms of what these early developmental psychologists were doing, is they were studying very young children and seeing where certain things come online for them conceptually, right? So at a certain point, you go back, far enough into the early learning processes of humans, and actually we don't see objects in the sense of like, oh, there's a thing out in the world, right? Like object permanence shows up as part of something that we learn about reality. We have to learn that objects are permanent. So before that, it's just this tableau of like, oh, there's the thing, and now that's there, but oh, now it's gone,
it's like
and now it
being
doesn't
on
exist
acid
anymore.
or something like
that.
Right. All these kids are just like, what's going on?
Yeah, it's like this, it's blooming, buzzing confusion in a sense. And so a lot of the distinctions that we identify get carved out through our own experience in this learning process. And so when you're really starting out, it's really like you're just everything, but in like a radically confused, adualistic way. Eventually, you do begin to differentiate yourself from the world and appreciate that entity field relationship. And so now you're a self, I guess you could say. And then that's sort of like, okay, the egocentrism is sort of the frame there, because you're actually at that point unable to fully take the perspective of another person or these kinds of things. And these are capacities that gradually come online. And so, it begins with a kind of focus on the self. And there's a key reason for this as well. So what Piaget called assimilation is really at the heart of it. So there are these two core dynamics, assimilation and accommodation. And basically what those are is, again, let's say you're an adual, you're just, everything's the same thing, right? I actually picked this example up from Wilber, I think, Ken Wilber, in one of his books, where he talks about, the child, sucks its thumb and it feels the sensation in its thumb. If it sucks a corner of its blanket, it doesn't feel that sensation. And so the mind starts to differentiate between like what is me in some sense and what isn't me. And so as that process kind of unfolds, and then you make that distinction, now you've got a category that you can kind of work with. There's a distinction there that you can kind of filter new information through. And that would be matching new information to existing concepts in your head. So if you fast forward a little bit, if you're in a house and you're a child and there's a dog in the house, you've got a category for dog because you see furry creature roaming around, not human-like, but, animal-ish, having certain characteristics. So you've got a category for that. Now, you go out and go to a farm and then you're shown a horse, and you might say, oh, look, it's a doggy, right? As a child. And then you get corrected and they're like, no, that's not a doggy, or that's a horse, right? So now what you've done is you've differentiated again. Now you have multiple concepts. And so that you are forced to accommodate to that information rather than assimilating it into what you already knew. And so the tendency for us is to assimilate information to what we already know. And this goes back to the active inference stuff and the predictive processing, right? We want to always kind of immediately assume that we know that we know. And it's surprise when we don't know, when we're like, oh, we actually have to accommodate to this new thing before us rather than just sort of, working mindlessly through categories we already have. So to answer your question, yes, we tend to assimilate before we're forced to accommodate. And you can see that actually in thermodynamic sense, in a sense, right? It's sort of like it's easier, it's less energetic expenditure to just sort of like, work through an existing framework rather than have to like, oh, okay, I've got to kind of adapt here, right? But that's exactly what it is. It's adaptation to environment rather than just sort of existing on the existing framework. So The reason why all that's important is because our tendency is towards assimilation. So egocentrism is a form of sort of assimilation in a radical sense. We know our own experience, but we have to learn that other people have experiences, and then we have to learn, other things about the world out there that aren't just immediately felt to us and understood by us. And this is why the learning process moves from a state of egocentrism and interpreting everything in terms of the self and in terms of how humans tend to operate and these kinds of things, to becoming increasingly more sensitive to when things are actually, they don't work like that at all. But you have to learn those things. Otherwise, you'll just assume that everything is kind of like you. And once you see that that's going on, it's a really profound insight into how humans make meaning, right? And not just at the individual level, but collectively, right? I mean, how you understand what the world is, what's out there, what kinds of beings or things exist, that itself is going to have, it can be more or less assimilatory or accommodating, you could say, to what's actually out there. And so different kinds of meaning frames and meaning systems that people are working with could be more anthropocentric. They could be more, animistic in terms of projection and seeing, other conscious agents and things that they're not necessarily there. Or it can lead to a more radically differentiated kind of thing. So anyway, I'm saying a lot of stuff here, but to answer your question.
Yeah, no, it's all, it makes sense. And that there's a process of, like learning those categories in some sense, and that knowledge structure like blocks out the complexity of that like chaos of uncertain things that kind of regulates your emotional state. As you kind of expand your domain of competence, you get better at doing that in like different circumstances. Like the child can do it, at first maybe in their bedroom or in their home, but then they have to go to school and figure that out in a kind of more novel, and you kind of scaffold that development as it goes till they get kind of better. And I suppose because the theory of mind.
Can I pick up something on there? This is important because just to tie something back in. Yes, exactly. I love how you made that connection in terms of like bracketing out chaos. That's so much of what we're doing most of the time with our cognition, right? Is like we're trying to find the small area in which we can have some kind of control and predictability and these kinds of things. Again, the predictive processing bit, but also the Petersonian and the other kinds of chaos versus order. But this also happens at the mythological level, right? In terms of how we make meaning. And if you look at the anthropological literature, and you work at the work of, say, like Mircea Eliade and folks like that, so much about human sociological functions are about bracketing out the chaos, right? It's the other, and we're the good. And then, even if you go back to like hunter-gatherer tribes or nomadic societies, right? It's like the individual tent or nomadic shrine is sort of like, this is the navel of the world. And you can see this throughout human cultures as sort of like, often like tribes, the names for themselves is like the real people or the true people, right? And then there's sort of, or you look at the Greeks and it's like, we're everyone else is barbaroi, the people that go bar. And so there's a kind of that assimilation tendency to interpret things in terms of the familiar leads to macroscopic forms of ethnocentrism, and often an inability to understand the inherent qualities of others, and an antipathy towards pluralism. And you can start to see the challenges that development and learning pose to, let's say, living in a more flourishing, open, thriving, happy, pluralistic, multicultural society, right? And so you get this sort of tension that people perceived as chaos and order. And so I think that these are deep mechanics that all emerge out of these very fundamental dynamics in terms of, really that can be traced down to sort of energy and information and, thermodynamic processes that we're expressions of. So I just wanted to make some of those connections, but sorry.
It's really good. I mean, because the problem, with figuring out, because that was the problem Peterson identified a lot. I think Carl Friston agreed with them as well in some sense, that if people have to be predictable to one another to an extent for us to be chill around each other. And so in like different situations where people have different norms and they can't predict each other, then there's this increased level of uncertainty. And traditionally that's why people are, I suppose, your group isn't just a social group, it's the ordering structure that makes sense of your reality, essentially. That's why people are so willing to fight and die, for what seems like arbitrary belief systems in some sense. Like that's what's keeping out the chaos, and the chaos is equivalent to death You know, it's the
Yep.
destruction of a world that makes sense to you
Yes.
on some level.
Yeah.
But also maybe that's because that can happen on an individual level. I don't know if you know Ronnie Janoff Bowman's work, Shattered Assumptions.
No,
Trauma
you're
is
giving me all
Shattered
these great
Assumptions.
recommendations. This is great. No, who's
Yeah,
that?
really interesting because it ties into the predictive processing very well, which is that
Mm.
like they're the priors, you know, your assumptions about reality, essentially your prior predictions about how things work, about what is, and that keep you grounded. Basically, it's like, oh,
Hmm.
I know this is going to go this way.
Yep.
You predict like you have a high hyper prior, all people are good people, but then you get attacked viciously in the street, and that hyper prior is just destroyed, and
Mm.
suddenly your entire relationships are all up for grabs. It's like, is this a
Yep.
good person? Is it a bad person? If I walk outside, is somebody going to attack me? You know, like that. Those prior predictions are keeping us stable in some sense in our, you know, psychological, our domain of combat, our domain of, I suppose, familiarity.
Yeah.
And so becoming, I guess we're kind of doing the metacognitive move of like becoming aware of that underlying structure, and then how to like, you know, edit that yourself. But maybe, I guess, yeah, I don't want to get too far away there, but
No, no, no.
that
This is
was
great.
coming up like
I want
that's
to riff on that for a minute because
yeah, yeah.
it's super important. Because gosh, why do I want to say that? I mean, the idea of nomos or anomie,
Mm,
which is these sociological ideas, right? So like the loss of meaning is the loss of a world. Right.
yeah,
And everything you're just saying
totally.
was really capturing that like
Love that.
it's not just, hey, we can all be chill because I can predict what you're going to do. It's that
Mm,
you're the kind of person that I've been around for a long time in which we've mutually constructed a shared world together. So like we see
yes.
the same things. We feel, we intuit the same things because we're inhabiting the same kind of social imaginary, and other people don't see the kinds of things that we see. And so there's an inherent threat
Yep.
there that's perceived often, at least from, let's say less complex formulations of this prospect, as
Mm,
that they're radically other. They're also, then because we're good, they're bad, and all this stuff. Now, what's interesting though about this is that, so when I had my meaning crisis, that was the experience of anomie, of the loss of a nomos, the loss of a world frame. And then it's like you've been living in a bubble, and then your bubble bursts, and now you're sort
yep.
of floating in the elements, and sort of, which way's up, which way's down. And if you
Frameless.
read the literature on people who have this experience, like Nietzsche talks about this experience with the madman
Death
going
of
as,
God.
death of God. Tolstoy describes this experience. There are various versions of it. And I talk about this as either vertigo, which is sort of you don't know which way is up or down anymore, or another version of it is nausea. So I think they're kind of two different versions.
Mm,
And nausea in the
sorry.
existentialist sense, yeah, the kind of existentialist, like, one damn thing after another. But it's just what's taken away is meaning, because you don't have the frame of evaluation anymore, because your whole way of understanding what is the case and what your valued goal state should be and what's really going on and how you should orient, all these things were framed by a world that no longer exists for you. And so that is an existential catastrophe, and that's a meaning crisis, right? And these can happen, I think, at individual and collective levels. And so, to bring back the
Mm,
question of the meaning crisis, I think that what's being gestured to there with that term, I interpret as speaking to something that's going on collectively, operating in a similar sort of way, that people are very confused about where our shared boundaries of meaning making lie. And therefore, there's a lot of polarization, a lot of othering, a lot of, rejection of pluralism, and all these things. There's a regressive sort of move.
mm-hmm.
There's a lot of assimilation and projection going on. All these things because we got a bunch of different people scrambling to sort of, frantically define the limits of a world, and defining them differently, and defining them in contrary terms. So there's some really interesting, fascinating sociological functions that can be re-understood now, basically in the language of, information theory, thermodynamics, and semantic information processing, and complexification. And I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, I like what you were talking about, the anomie, like the Vervaeke calls it domicide, the
Mm,
destruction of a home in a sense, like the loss of, and I really think that three-factor model of like coherence, purpose, significance, like tracks that
mm,
meaningful worldview, the meaningful structure, and that when you lose that, it's like your whole frame of reality is gone in some sense. And
mm.
we've kind of weirdly developed a society where that the frame is being broken all the time. It's very
Yeah,
hard. The technology is constantly breaking frame. Like
yeah,
social media, I think in a sense is designed to get you to that point where it's like it's going to give you just more and more if that makes you a better consumer, I suppose. But the
Well,
loss of the
but
frame,
it does
yeah.
a couple of different things, though, doesn't it? Because it both keeps breaking the frame, but also it's an algorithm designed to make you happy at just sort of a very
Confirmation
basic, yeah,
bias.
exactly. So it actually winds up at the same time it's breaking the frames for everyone. It's like
Yeah.
making more of the frames rigid and hyper specific to every person,
And
so like,
narrowing
yeah,
them in the kind of reciprocal narrowing sense.
yep,
Yeah. But
totally.
there's an interesting, I'm kind of like thinking a meta move here, like Peterson's The Hero's Journey, which is the path of transcendence, essentially, which is that when the frame breaks, you go into the chaos, you encounter the unknown, you make sense of it, you rebuild a better frame, like what you're
Yeah.
doing with your work. And then that frame becomes, a frame that can, I suppose, capture, can be that meaningful world again in some sense. But I guess, do you think there is a final frame, or are we always in this position of meta framing in some
Well,
sense,
I
like that
think,
the
yeah,
frame
I mean,
always
the
breaks
meta,
and we have to make a new one, you know?
yeah. I mean, all right, so it's an interesting thing because language is hard here, but in some senses, the final frame is the meta frame, which is that once you realize this is a recursive
Yes.
process, then it's not like, oh, now I found the frame and it's not going to break. It's just that the frame is so abstract that when the frame breaks, you're like, oh yeah, this is another version of that. And
Yeah.
so what's interesting is that then you get comfortable with it. You can predict that the frame will break, and so you don't exist in anomie, right? You've built into your world modeling, right? And so this is this meta recursive move that I think is really profoundly helpful and insightful for people. And it takes a lot of complexity to do that. And this is also part of it, is that like more and more the learning that unfolds through these developmental models is a learning process that allows us to hold increasing levels of hierarchical complexity that get us to a point where we're comfortable with that kind of meta move and we can live in that world. And that's something like what, people like James Fowler called the conjunctive mode of faith, or fifth order consciousness and Keegan's model, that level of sort of meta-systematic complexity plus that allows you to hold multiple frames at once, and frame breaking itself as part of the meta frame. That's all really important. So there's that point. And then the other point I wanted to make, though, is that the frame breaking is learning. Like that is the learning
Model
algorithm.
updating and the
Yeah,
predictive
exactly. And
processing.
so like the universal learning process is a continually frame breaking experience. And so, but that can either be felt as chaos, which in some ways it is for a moment relative to its past ordered state. But if you can get to that higher complexity vantage, then it's progress, it's transcendence. And so that's the meta frame, is that you get this stacked layered notion of a developmental sequence of frame breaking, and that every time that happens and can be successfully integrated into a higher order whole, you're actually participating in a cosmic evolutionary learning process. Now, I find that frame to be very beautiful and sublime, because then the prediction of your world, in a sense, falling apart becomes a not a negative thing, but a positive thing that you can orient to intentionally, predict to some degree. But, and here's also the really important point, some frame breaking is chaotic and dissolution bringing. Other frame breaking is the basis of awe, right? The basis of wonder. So when we experience the sublime and we are struck by something that is just so outside of our expected norms, something so unusually interesting, we experience this profound feeling of curiosity and interest, and it calls something out of us. It calls something more out of us. And this is my notion of what the sacred is doing, basically. Is like the sacred is that kind of meta frame that is we use the template of what's been sacred in the past to predict what also is going to be intuited as sacred, and to be the model for how the sacred itself will continue to complexify. And so I think that when we have experiences of awe and wonder and sublimity and these transcendent experiences, mystical experiences, these are radical frame breaks that are perceived not as anomie, but as an introduction, or at least an invitation into a more complex frame. And that is actually experienced as the most meaningful thing we can do. So there's another kind of meta move there, that like, on the one hand, in a predictive processing way, what we want most is to not experience surprise, but actually not really. What we really want is to update our model more successfully, right? And that's what that experience of awe and insight is like, oh, I get it better now. and I see, and wow, this is really good. And so that is a surprise, but it's reorganizing you for the better rather than dissolving your world. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, oh man, like that was so good. There's so much in there of like that we're made I in predictive processing they call it that we're made to be slope chasers, that we're
Mm.
made to be like optimally reducing error, and obviously flow is experienced as that
Hmm.
optimal between anxiety and boredom.
Yep.
Um and that also the point about the shattered assumptions trauma thing is like when you have assumptions that are deeply unconscious, that are lifting a lot of heavy weight, that are suddenly kind of swept out from under you almost, that's when you get the trauma stuff. Whereas you're almost pointing
Mm.
to like the opposite experience in some sense, that you can have this incredibly positive, transformative experience that, you know, breaks the frame, but in a way that almost encourages, I'm thinking about a curiosity or a desire, I suppose, to approach that awe and approach or a kind of pilgrimage to the awe that's like the same thing but very different experiences in a way
Yeah. Yeah.
that are so,
Well,
yeah,
and
so different.
to go a little bit out on a limb here, but I find this really interesting and profound, at least phenomenologically. Going back
Mhm.
to the idea that mythological framings are kind of low resolution, distillations of some of these deep mechanics that are giving us some of these
Totally.
ideas to orient to in a maximal way. If you look at, let's say, we'll use God in Dante's articulation. So, if you read the Divine Comedy, Dante gets up into paradise and he goes to the celestial heavens. He's leveling up. He's transcending, and he's moving closer to the divine, to the sacred. And when he finally gets to the end, so to speak, it's not an end, because there in the final chapters or the final cantos of the Paradiso, he's beholding what is called the Empyrean. It's these series of concentric circles that at the center of which is God burning, like fire, and then all the angels are
Mm,
swirling around. And but as you, in a sense, move in, it's constantly receding. Dante doesn't so much draw this out, but it's in a lot of different versions. My own symbolic representation of this is the kaleidoscopic eye. But there's something that basically, the more you zoom in on the sacred or the divine, the more it keeps receding. Not in a sense of, oh, you can never touch it and it's always, it's actually a delightful invitation to keep gazing
mm,
deeper. I was actually very influenced by Jean-Luc Marign's book, God Without Being, because he talks about the way that we have idols and icons. And what an idol does is it stops the gaze, right? You have something that's really beautiful and lustrous and a statue, and you're like, the God, wow, it's so beautiful. But now you're just looking at a thing and you're saying, that the God. And so that's what an idol does. It fixes
mm.
something and it kind
Sucks
of
it into
gives you,
itself.
yeah, and
Mm,
now it's sort of almost like a mirror. But what an icon does is it draws you in to a sort of inexhaustible depth of profundity and divinity and beauty, and there is no bottom. It's an invitation or a portal into something that keeps, in a sense, receding, but not receding again in a negative sense, but becoming more like a more something with greater depth and greater expansiveness. And so I think this is a great metaphor image of this profound cosmic mystery that we're before, right? The more we learn, the more there is to learn. The more we learn, more questions we hadn't even thought to ask. But the more we answer those questions, we both experience delight, but we also learn new things about things we didn't even know. And so we are learning the universe, and we're learning more about what we don't know. We're learning more about who we are. We're learning more about what the universe is. We are, as Carl Sagan said, a way for the universe to know itself. And the whole time we're kind of moving deeper and deeper into the mystery, rendering it known, increasing the complexity, but also the mystery keeps receding into higher degrees of complexity, calling us forth into higher degrees of transcendence. And I think something like the Empyrean is a wonderful mythological description of this sort of sacred process that it is the calling us up into something, into greater and greater degrees of transcendence that doesn't have a quote unquote final frame. The final frame is the continual receding of the horizon into greater and greater things.
Oh man. So have you ever heard of Saint Gregory of Nyssa's idea,
Yeah.
epictasis? It's something like that. I think that's straining forward in a sense of
Yep.
like the finite approaching the infinite. That's a real gain. Like you're really actually, getting closer, but it's also not completely like incomprehensible. You can't kind of wrap your arms around it. So there's something. So like, here's a proposal for you. The final frame is the process of the meta framing, that you're participating in it. There isn't a particular frame. The frame's going to break down. You remake another frame. That process is what's represented in the hero's journey mythologically. That's the kind of meta narrative in some sense. And in our participation of that, Dante is a good example of that as well, because he brings in the moral aspect into the hero's journey, like explicitly in a way that it's actually this like moral journey of transcendence, that we approach the infinite. Now, I would say the infinite, as in God, is what is beyond all frames. Like that's the reality. And so we're approaching through frames like icons or images, but the icons of the images are not the thing beyond the frame in some sense as well. They're always just like, you know, getting us closer, but not the thing itself. How does that
exactly? Yeah, no, totally. And I think that is the invitation then to appreciate the sacred through the icon. And that, I think, is where you could call it deep piety, or, you know, and it's both I mean, most of my spiritual journey has been one of longing and desire, but it is also punctuated by these profound, you know, moments of, you could say, fulfillment, I suppose. But each fulfillment is also then the leg, or the starting leg of a new journey into a new kind of longing. So it's, you know, but there's so much to say, what you know, to what you've said. I think that's how I think about it. Is this leads into the apophatic mysticism, right? Of the God as the not thing, right? It's so, because once you appreciate the radical receding nature of each image, right, then whatever is generating those images is beyond the image. And so we move closer to what's beyond the image through the image, but we're always only getting an image. By the time we're engaging the image, it's just an image. And so we're always moving through those. And so I find that a really fascinating dialectic, because on the one hand, we need images. Like, and I've made this point for a long time. Like, this is part of the work of mythopoets and, you know, creative spiritual types, of like, we need symbols and art and music. And we need the creative expression so that we can paint a face on the faceless divinity or something like that, right? Because we're finite and we need some kind of mediated form. But those can ossify and get stuck, and then people think, we got the God, and now, you know, and this is mostly where, like, not just fundamentalism, but even very kind of, you know, classic traditional forms of religion gets hung up. They think they have the answer, when in fact it's just a mask of God. I think was how Joseph Campbell kind of talked about this. And so I think, there's a real strong sense of, if you give yourself into that conception of divinity, it's an infinitely rich and expanding sense of it. And one that leads into the divine darkness, right? And you know, folks like Pseudo-Dionysius and other Christian mystics and non-Christian mystics talk about this. So there's something huge to that. I also wanted to throw in that, maybe you're kind of getting at this point, but like, there's clearly something about the way in which the meta frame is the final frame. But then also, I don't want to just say that, because there's probably something also orthogonal to all of this as well that we want to stay open to, so that we don't just think, oh, well, it's some version of this always, right? Maybe there's a rupture at some point and we don't know. And so I think staying open and humble to the possibilities of what a bigger frame can be is really important, because then that's just sort of a subtle way of reifying the frame that you're using, even if you're going meta on it or something, right? So the prospect of radical eruption or something into the frame, I think, is something to continually hold open. And that is, again, sort of the receptivity to the mystery as true mystery, to some degree. Maybe that's what faith is about.
Yeah, I mean, faith, the courage to go on, or the trust or confidence to go on the journey, to participate in that process, even when the feedback might be bad in some sense, of like, you're experiencing massive amounts of uncertainty, massive amounts of difficulty, but you still have to persevere because you have the confidence in that. But something that was coming up while you were speaking, which is obviously another hero's journey, but in similar to Dante, I think, that does it in a different way, which is Plato's cave, which is epistemic, I think, in a way, but also because, like, I think that process, the complexification you're talking about, is almost like the journey out of the cave, where it's like the model, you're encountering what's beyond the model, and so your salience landscaping literally needs to adapt and be transformed, and you're blinded and you stop, and then you can encounter more. It's like, it's kind of like what the child is doing, and then you get, you know, to a reasonable amount, but then you have to go beyond the kind of societal conventional morality, I think what Kohlberg calls it, of expanding, integrating, but you become more expansive in that sense of like more capable of handling the light outside of the knowledge structure in a real way. That's a genuine illumination, I think. And then I suppose the theory is if you scale that up, you get to the beatific vision, you get to the beholding the good, as Plato calls it. But I think there's an epistemological development in there that's real as well. That's real gains. That seems to be on a continuum with what you're saying.
Yeah, and
If
I
that
mean, to
makes
bring
sense.
it back to the book and to the developmental models, I think that's a version of that, right? I mean,
Yes.
basically,
Yeah.
genetic epistemology is the recognition that there's actually levels and layers of a taxonomy to our epistemology. It's not just like we know things; it's that there are types of knowing, and they're of increasing degrees of adequacy in terms of how they disclose reality to us. And so I think that's partly why I got really interested in developmental models after being really interested in like Dante and the apophatic
Yeah.
mystics, is because there's a very similar structure there, right? And the
Yeah.
idea that as you level up your epistemology, which is basically, increasing the hierarchical complexity with which you can hold the various aspects of reality, you are getting more of something. And complexity is probably just one part of this, right? But it's still a very important part. And probably this structure maps onto other kinds of experiences as well. Of course, things like integral models would also bring in other lines of development in terms of, I don't know, let's say emotional depth, or where you can look at the waking up vector on its own terms as sort of a increasing progression of understanding. So there's a lot of different ways that this manifests, but at least just from the book that I'm working through and what I'm trying to get at in terms of how meaning itself evolves, it's a version of this process of successively more comprehensive disclosures of reality that radically reframe and reconfigure your sense of ultimate value, basically. And then once you see that that's unfolding, you can see that in your own life and think about how you, across your own lifespan, you've been engaged in hopefully leveling up and developing your conceptions of God, let's say, but also how collectively we've been doing this across millennia, as we've built on the knowledge of people who've come before, and we've learned more aspects of reality, and more things begin to disclose themselves. So yeah, there's radical transcendence all around us in our own lives, in our history. And I think that's part of this revolution, if you want to call it that, of meaning that's kind of characteristic of this metamodern shift out of postmodernity. It's like, yeah, of course, there's meaning everywhere, and just to live a life is to be so full of the experience of and the potential for meaning.
Yeah, and as you were speaking there, I was thinking of John Vervaeke's idea of reciprocal opening, that like the opposite of addiction in some sense, that as you actually start to expand out, you gain a capacity to get meaning from more things. Like addiction is in like your meaning narrows to just one specific thing, one super salient kind of drug of choice. Whereas that this is the opposite, that you can start to take more and more meaning and joy from essentially everything. It's like I imagine that's what it's like to be like a sage or a saint. Is just like you're just like, yeah, this is, I mean, you're kind of in the light of the good or God, continually, which is an amazing, I think if you can bookmark that for people in some sense, because I explained this to people in the course, I did a seminar, I actually ended on Dante's
Oh,
the whole
cool. That's
journey as
awesome.
well, which is really interesting
Oh,
because
wow. Yeah.
I like to try and explain that to people, and people were like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense actually. Like I can see how like that would be, and trying to draw the connection from the mechanisms, from the predictive process, and from that to that grand
Yeah.
narrative. People are like, oh shit, okay, I'm actually in this in some sense.
Mm.
Like,
Yeah.
I can participate in this great story, which
Yeah.
is
No,
meaningful.
that's beautiful. Totally. Yeah, I have a million more things to say about that, but yeah, I'm happy to go wherever you want.
Yeah, I think we might be running out of time here, but I I mean this work you're doing, man, is amazing. It's so timely, and so great to speak to you about it.
Thank
So
you.
I'm definitely going to encourage people to pick up a copy of the books and to check out also your podcast and your essays and everything. Because this is the work people need to be seeing.
Oh, I really appreciate that, and thank you. That's much appreciated. Yeah, I hope that uh, you know if people are finding this kind of conversation interesting, if they can see that what I'm trying to do, like with this book, is a kind of rigorous academic, but hopefully accessible rendition of the architectonics of this process, that's not necessarily going to appeal to everyone, but I'm trying to do a very comprehensive take on this. So this is going to be this 10 volume or so thing, but you gotta do some ground laying, right? So you have to talk about what is meaning and what is learning, and then here what does human learning look like, and what are the specifics there.
Yeah.
And then the next volume is going to be getting into what does this look like and how does it relate to the collective human learning process of history, before you're kind of getting off to the races and then going through the different meaning structures that have emerged and that people relate to, and specifically in terms of how they conceive of the divine. Is one of my most It's one of the most central interests, I would say, for me. And actually to be able to be doing currently some research with a lot of different data to be able to actually track the complexification learning sequence of how people learn God, basically, as an idea, is like it's awesome. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's what all this is about, and that's what the whole work is aiming at. But I really appreciate this conversation, because I feel like you've broken open the nut of like what is at the heart of this. Whereas if you were to, I'm worried that if people just pick up these books, they're going to be like, well, where is this all going? This all sounds very, technical and something. But like, if you can kind of follow the through line here, it actually does, I think, lead to something very cool and profound, hopefully. So that's, I appreciate it.
I can't wait to read more, to be honest. That's like exactly similar thing I'm working on, of trying to bring this stuff together for people like me and you. Essentially, you've had that experience of like getting the frame broken, the anomie, facing into that meaning crisis, having to pick up the pieces and explore all these like frameworks and stuff. Like, how can we pay it forward for next generations of like giving them something, more solid, so nobody has to fall into that hole again.
Yeah, well said. And I mean, that is something that's very important to me in terms of the broad swath of stuff that I try to put out into the world, is to help with that very practically, right? Because these are experiences that people have, that they're increasingly having, and that to just have a map of some of that, to appreciate that you're not necessarily just falling through the void, but that you're potentially growing and developing along the path, is a radical reframing of the entire experience. And if I'd had some of that earlier, that would have helped me a lot, I think. I think the more if we built this stuff into our pedagogy and our education and our university systems and everything, and we got, I don't want to say back to, but there's certainly a way this harkens to some versions of sort of a more expansive sense of, education and expansion of growth and wisdom seeking, of sort of moving up grades, right? We have the sense of grades and levels of moving through our academic life. But imagine that imbued with more social, emotional depth and spiritual significance, that you're actually kind of working through some cosmic curriculum in a meaningful way. And so anyway, when people have these experiences of meaninglessness and anomie and a loss of world and domicile, it's sort of like, if the more we can provide resources for people to make it understood that there's a broader frame in which you can understand these kinds of experiences, and that they actually might be really transformative and transcendent, then hopefully that's really healing and helpful for people. So yeah, and to the degree I see you doing the same thing, and all the awesome stuff that you're doing in the teaching and your academic work and this podcast, kudos, man. It's good stuff.
Get the job done. Thank you very much, Brendan.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.